Hello and welcome to the DeepMed seminar, which is hosted by the ERC group DeepMed, the history of Mediterranean science and strategy from 1860 to the present. I'm Lino Camprovi, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mohamed Gamal-Eldin, who is going to talk no less than about the Suez Canal and the making of the Mediterranean. So we are very looking forward to this talk. And Mohamed is working now at Newark University, and he got his PhD there. He studies basically urban history, mixing, I think, or bringing together social history and environmental studies, also with history of medicine. And his main point is always to look at infrastructure, the built environment, and state making, the making of the colonial entanglements, and so on. So we are very much looking forward to this talk. He has worked extensively on the Suez Canal, and now is the moment in which he's going to extend that work onto the whole of the Mediterranean Sea and or region. So that's quite of a challenge, and we thank you for accepting it. When you're ready, we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Lino. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all at Deep Med for inviting me. Hopefully, I can meet your high challenge. As you'll see, I try to weave together a number of different stories related to the making of the Suez Canal and what we could call the making of a modern Mediterranean, although that's very needs a lot of defining, as we'll see. So I'll begin here. The title of my presentation is the Suez Canal. Oh, sorry.
Mohammed, I'm so sorry. Could you I don't think you're sharing it.
Thank you for the reminder.
Sorry.
So I'll share. No. There. Can we all see?
Yes, thank you. That's perfect.
Great. Once again, the title of the presentation is The Suez Canal and the Making of the Modern Mediterranean. I'm going to start off with a poem on the city of Port Said. Oh, the city of the lighthouse and the canal. Oh, the city of the strength and the struggle. Oh, Port Said, my home. Oh, Port Said, my home. I stand here protecting my canal. I stand here protecting my sand. I pass by the doors, waiting for the return of my neighbors. Oh, Port Said, my home. Oh, Port Said, my home. This is from a Simsia singer from Port Said. Uh, as Port Said grew into a major port for the offloading of goods, people, materials, including a collection of coal, it would by the end of the 20th century become a highway for oil and goods and container ships. Yet simultaneous to the growth of the port and canal, the Mediterranean Sea and the nations surrounding it saw a rise in ships, goods, people, and even a change in marine life across the region. Seated on the Mediterranean Sea, Port Said, established in 1859, became a vital Egyptian and Mediterranean city due to its relationship with the Suez Canal. It would become a center of global traffic. I'm going to switch slides. It would become a center of global traffic, and as Valeska Huber describes it, the canal points to worldwide interconnectedness and points to different spatial configurations and different geographies of the global, with the canal functioning simultaneously as a magnet, a sluice, a gate, and a semi-permeable membrane or boundary. Most of all, it is a city and port made by and intimately connected to various levels of infrastructure. The land that the city sits upon was originally built through the excavation of sand from the waterway, which was excavated by dredgers at the bottom of the canal that would run at the eastern border of Port Said. Laborers and dredgers moved the sand that sat in the sun as it hardened and helped to keep the marsh waters of Lake Menzela and the alluvial sediment from the Mediterranean, which was originally from the Nile River, at bay. The new port city was and continues to be protected by two jetties of limestone sand aggregate blocks made of material from around the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Some material shipped in even from other surrounding areas of the Mediterranean, including Malta. This helped to speed up the reclamation of land in Port Said, assisting in the growth of the city and port, and in general the Suez Canal. Both infrastructural projects, that of the canal and of city building, have guided the growth of the social and built environment in the city since its conception. The city's spatial layout, as you can see here, the three major cities along the Suez Canal, looked out at Port Said on the beaches of the Mediterranean, but it is anchored to the port systems and maintenance facilities of the canal. Thus, changes in the city and the growth of the city was assisted by the reclamation of land from the bottom of the canal and Lake Menzela, and due to these constraints of land and water, the growth of the city eastward across the canal into the Sinai was inevitable. Port Fouad was to be where new neighborhoods and the related infrastructure that went along with it came with a major transplantation of Suez Canal employees to the new city. And as you read, a building of an entire new city with new infrastructure and new homes, and etching into the physical layout of the city a master plan that dictated which neighborhoods were desirable and who could live in which neighborhood. On top of that, the changes in the city were integrally linked to the growth of the ports. As the canal was dredged, three major basins were born and grew in importance, aiding to the smooth movement of people and goods through Port Said. Over the next century, new ports and the expansion into the Sinai with the establishment of Port Fouad will go on to help grow the larger region, as Port Said will become understood to be, into one of the world's largest container ports by 2016. As the world's 19th century powers began to organize transnationally through global sanitary conferences like the ones in 1892, 1894, and 1897, to prevent the spread of cholera, plague, and other diseases, the canal became both a zone of concern and a central place in which to manage, stop, and quarantine those who may have been sick. This led to increased concern for ships that had come to the Ottoman Empire after had come through the Ottoman Empire after the annual pilgrimage season in particular. In the Mediterranean Sea, ships that that would be concerned could be quarantined at Suez, Port Said, and even in the Mediterranean at Cyprus or Malta before entering a European port. Whereas earlier in the 19th century, Alexandria had been the principal concern for international health officials in the Mediterranean, this new space of transportation and movement raised fears in global capitals. And here is an image of another quarantine station, El Tor. This new space of transportation and movement raised fears in global capitals about the chances of a global pandemic. Cairo and Great Britain sent representatives to negotiate and they control the terms of quarantine, health management, and passage through the canal, working with the Suez Canal Company and the cities that worked to increase health measures and protect against sickness. Health, hygiene, and sanitation became a major concern for the cities, their urban populations, and the greater Mediterranean region. Thus, new rationales on quarantines were decided by the international conferences. And not only were they working to make their own towns more salubrious, they were playing a part in lessening global fears about the canal and its cities as a zone of contagion. Turning back to the ports themselves, as Lala Khalili says, the construction of new harbors requires landscapes to be dramatically reshaped, not only where harbors are being built, but also in distant locales where the raw materials of construction are excavated. As the Suez Canal began to be dredged in 1856-57, it was thought to be more than just a throughway for global ship traffic. That was ultimately signaled by the foundation of a port on the Mediterranean Sea uh, that would become a central node along the route to uh, uh, India and Asia. Coal stations and depots for empire also expanded the infrastructure of empire in the 19th century Mediterranean. Thus, Port Said became a major node for coal refueling along the sea route between the colonies and Europe, and as Onbarak states, the Suez Canal drove the infrastructural explosion in the late 19th century by helping to reduce the distance between coaling stations. Port Said, founded in 1859, at first supported the movement of material and peoples to the canal zone as part of the logistical undertaking that was the canal project. The growth of the port in the city helped the creation of two massive breakwater jetties, as we discussed, the western one 3.5 miles long, and the eastern breakwater 1.5 miles. This was followed by three major basins, new docks, warehouses adjacent to the development Port Said and in Port Fouad. Over the 19th century, as ships grew in size, so did the width and the depth of the canal. The expansion of the expansion of the port facilities and canal were to keep up with the growing tonnage and size of modern ships. Over the 20th century, ship sizes passing through the canal increased as ship technology adapted to the canal and global capitalism demanded. At the turn of the century, it was about 12,000 tons. But with the advent of tankers after the discovery of oil in the Middle East, first in Abadan, then in the Arabian Peninsula, tonnage grew to hundreds of thousands. Yet this would only increase after the suspension of canal traffic between 67 and 1975 due to the Egyptian-Israeli war. Post 1975, it was not only with the rise of supertankers filled with Gulf oil, but the growth of container ships carrying goods from Asian ports to global markets that would change the ports, canals, and logistics centers adjacent. This expansion also led to an increase in the amount of coal stored at depots as more and more became needed to fuel the empire's ship traffic. As you can see here, by 1890, five coaling stations in the Mediterranean. The expansion of port facilities, warehouses, coincided with the rise of new opportunities of employment, of course. A new town of Port Fouad was designed along Garden City principles that borrowed from English Newtown projects and remade the colonial landscape. It led to the development of a new urban conglomerate on the eastern side of the canal in the Sinai. Port Fouad would grow within the safety of the eastern breakwater to include new warehouses, workshops, dry docks, port facilities for the repair of ships, offloading of goods, etc. Port Fouad and its facilities would continue to grow during the 20th century in tonnage it would accept. Port Said would develop a free trade zone, replicating other port centers around the globe, increasing its part to play in one of the leaders of port traffic in Egypt and the Mediterranean. In 2002, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak inaugurated East Port Said, which was formed as an alliance between private and state partners in an area just east of Port Fouad. The new port, also called the Suez Canal Container Terminal, will be controlled by APM Terminals, the Dutch Port Management Company, and the Egyptian state. These new facilities would mean the growth of the state-of-art logistics and equipment, as well as the building of cranes, refrigeration units, and container systems to move and offload goods from some of the world's largest container vessels passing through the canal. The influx of bigger ships would require more employees, and of the migration of new populations from across the Mediterranean zone and across Egypt. These new populations brought with them new demands for safer labor practices, increased representation, upward mobility in the company, fair pay, as well as anti-colonial protest, as evidenced by the various strike movements in Port Said and other Mediterranean cities. Residents of the Suez Canal Zone would go on to have some of the highest literacy rates and lowest unemployment rates in Egypt. But additionally, the Port Said would be a part of a worldwide interconnectedness that Huber argues made the Suez Canal City an unusual space of global connections and local interactions that continues to expand in the 20th century. As we'll see, the city's populations would rise up in rebellion, and that has continued to follow the growth of the city and its ports as a major center of global movement of materials and ships and an essential logistical hub for the world's capital. Now, turning to a discussion of nostalgia and interconnectedness with former European residents. I start off with a quote from a journal called Timsa, a former resident of the city of Ismailia writes, Timsa, or crocodile, you become a symbol of nostalgia. We search for memories of the past as if we don't have enough of the present to give life a semblance of magic. Now, using the newsletter Timsa, I have shown in previous writings how the former colonizer resident, even in a semi-colonial space or company town setting, did not let go of their hold on the former spaces. As they try to keep pieces and recreate smells and tastes, they demonstrate their colonial and Orientalist gaze on the landscape of Ismailia and the region of the Suez Canal.
Sorry,
Not
Mohammed, excuse me just a second.
Yes,
What slide are you showing now?
I'm showing the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean Sea.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sorry about that. Okay, go ahead. I thought you were already moving ahead. Okay, thanks a lot.
I will move ahead. This is the break.
In due time. Okay, thanks a lot. Keep going.
Sorry. So not the Ismailia or canal of the present, but the one of the past. The need to connect themselves to the past helped link the peoples across the Mediterranean with the imaginary past and the post-colonial present future. Methodologically, the paper here, or what I write here, use the stories, recipes, histories, and memoirs found in the newsletter Journal de Timsa as the primary source of engagement to get at ideas of memory, exile, leaving, and space in the post-nationalization context of Egypt and in France. The foundation of a historical society and a newsletter to commemorate living in Ismailia was founded in the 1970s by former Canal Company employees and their children to record memories and write histories of a place once lived in, but now filled with memories created from imaginings of the past and a past life and ideal community. Those who were part of the association and journal's production were family members of former Canal Company pilots, engineers, and business owners. The association and journal worked in tandem to curate a place for memory and the sharing of past lives and to plan future trips. There's a sense of pride as it relates to the place and degree of connections this major 19th century engineering project elicited. Memory here is used as a way towards understanding the way all aspects of life in the canal cities were imagined in the past, today, and the future by those who edited, contributed, and participated in TIMSA and the association. As such, a community was formed across the sea around language, the physical urban spaces along the canal, and shared memories of life in Egypt. I argue this imagined return to a space that is no longer your own hints to the creation of a new temporal space in culture, literature, and history writing. As such, this case study begins to pull at the threads of memory and placemaking in the Suez Canal city of Ismailia and Port Said, in particular, to better understand the historical lineages of leaving, exile, post-coloniality, and imagined histories with the world of their past, the Suez Canal, and the world of their present, France and Europe. Following the October War in 1973, a group of former residents that lived in Ismailia prior to the war and nationalization of the canal formed an association to commemorate and memorialize the building of the canal and to paint a picture of the social life of the town, as you can see here. As a local and unofficial institution to the preservation of memory, ran by and former residents of the canal cities, the journal, annual events, and trips helped to curate a historical view of the life of Egypt prior to Egyptian nationalization in 56. Part of the association's calendar value annual events was a soiree where those with connections to Ismailia came together to share a meal and see acquaintances. These meetings in the post colonial environment of the French metropole were both a means to relive memories of a past life. It would be commemorated through the association and newsletter. The journal became a forum that linked those with familiar connections and a place where one could share addresses. If you were passing through a town where a former Egyptian, a former resident from Egypt lived, you might get a drink and a story. You could share photographs like you see here, history, both ancient Egyptian and modern, personal stories, and of course, recipes. Dinner, events, trips, and the journal articles thus become a tool of memory that etched a particular fantasy in a similar fashion to what Pierre Nora calls the symbolic typology. Photographs and historical essays erect these symbolic monuments to the past. The added benefit of planned trips to revisit, as one former resident, Sylvia Modelileski, argues, is a chance to revisit, to see the country and cities as a tangible connection to the expatriates' memories. Under headings like uh, uh, in memory, the Timsah published images supplied by residents of past class photos, costume parties, Suez Canal administrators, and ship pilots, views of Ismailia and the shore, as well as ships that pass through the canal. It is a field where photographs harken back to the memory of Ismailia, as you can see here. Nostalgia and un souvenir are powerful emotions that are used throughout the entire run of Timsah. The journal depicted the simpler time during French colonial company rule along the Suez Canal, images of verdant parks, and a bathing chateau along Lake Timsah create an idyllic image that leads as much more it leads as much more complicated it leads a much more complicated past where neighborhoods were divided and labor was hierarchized by ethnicity. To gloss over inequities of the past for the sake of memorialization of an imagined past appears here as part of a post colonial process of memory making. Um, Post colonial scholar Dennis Walder admits of his own place having been born in apartheid South Africa. In post colonial writing, the creation of myself refracted through past, as he says. Timsa, as such, stands as an uncritical journal to colonial memory. By using the narrative form of history, writing the journal offers a seemingly objective view of life in Ismailia or Port Said. The journal further adds to the orientalized imaginary of life in the colony, with a particular focus in the early issues on Egyptian recipes. It was a veritable smorgasbord of local cuisines that are prepared for the association's readers. There's a list of supplies that you could find at local stores, where you might find it, at which local stores in France. First detailed under the heading Egyptian recipes, and then later at your stove. Dishes like bulgur stuffed pigeon, prawns over rice pilaf, tahina, musa, gatu umali, and the tea ceremony of the Bedouins all speak to this. As Lala Khalili recently argued in a review article of Iranian cookbooks, recipes are indeed political. Here, recipes are used as a form of memory making, and the hope is to return aromas, taste, and foods back into the mind of the reader. What you once had in Ismailia and family outings or prepared by your housekeeper can now be produced across the sea at home in the new home in the post colonial environment of France. The crocodile sipping champagne, which was their mascot, wearing a beret, portrays the view of the social life of the Egyptian cuisine is set to evoke. Thus, food is a powerful tool of nostalgia that moves across the sea quite easily with the those exiled, and is evoked to trigger memories of a happier day on holiday or with family around table enjoying these delicacies. One can imagine the memories that simmer up to the surface when one thinks back to outings at the club or restaurant for the Red Sea prawns, which are typically large, of warm summer days near the saltwater lake of Lake Timsah, eating while on a break from sunbathing or swimming. Finally, association members could travel back to Egypt and Ismailia for a tour through the past. The excursion was a perfect way to locate physically memories and revisit life in the colonial town where one was born. In earlier issues, the travelers relate the state of architectural monuments post Egyptian Israeli warfare. They point out what was destroyed and what had been restored, and it becomes evidence of the destruction incurred, in a way, of Israeli bombardment of Ismailia. Annual trips give expatriates a reason to explore their memories, and peppered along these texts are photographs of travelers and Egyptians, in effect, a slideshow of Egyptian travel. It highlights a complicated, problematic story of the creation of the canal. The statue is representative of European involvement in the sovereign affairs of Egypt and the leading of Egyptian narratives of forced labor and low status under colonial company rule of the Suez Canal Company. Yet they pose next to the statue of Ferdinand de Lesseps in a junkyard on the eastern side of Port Said, seemingly only meant to commemorate a past where he stood at the Mediterranean entrance. The last issue of April 2017, memories had faded, and the association had decreased in membership and apparently readership. On average, the journal was 35 to 40 pages in length. Thus, memories fade, and with the loss of members, largely probably due to old age, those who remember or have ties, real or imagined, with the city of Ismailia are few and far between. As such, Timsah, the journal, provides a unique archive into this post-colonial memory. Now, finally, tying it back into the marine life of the Mediterranean. Turning to the world under the sea in the canal, as you all have discussed extensively in your sessions prior to my talk today, the Mediterranean uh, is a place where you could also look at the confluence of war and science, but also the changing nature of the Mediterranean forever due to the migration of marine biota from the Red Sea through the Suez Canal and into the Mediterranean Sea. Over the 20th century, the amount of marine biota from the Red Sea into the canal and into the Mediterranean has increased to a degree that the marine ecology of the Eastern Mediterranean has been changed. Beginning in the 1930s, as many of you may know, scientists in Mandate Palestine began to realize that studying the marine life of the Mediterranean and Red Seas needed to be studied and cataloged. The project expanded, and the more scientists began to collect knowledge of the Mediterranean, the more they began to want to understand the changes that were happening in the Mediterranean from the Suez Canal, but they could only make inferences because of their access to the Suez Canal. But studying the canal's influence on the marine biota of the Mediterranean Sea led to the need to study the canal's water system. But how would one do that? That's what we'll see here. There has been a lot of work on the marine life of the Eastern Mediterranean, as we see here in this seminar arranged by DeepMed, but also including Karen Alberg's writing on the jellyfish that migrated to the Mediterranean Sea and began attacking the cooling system of Israel's coal-powered electric plants along the shore. Similarly, I argue, like Alberg states, Lessepian species have profoundly affected local ecologies in the Mediterranean Sea. If you're unfamiliar, the species that have migrated through the Red Sea are referred to as Lessepian, referencing Ferdinand de Lesseps. As such, this section looks at a part of the Israeli and Smithsonian Institute's project to better understand the seas. On the 5th of June 1967, war between Egypt and Israel broke out. It heightened tensions due to Nasser and his military chief's provocations with Israel and amid fears of Israeli offensive led to war in the Sinai. The goal was to secure the peninsula and the Suez Canal, and to most likely cross the canal and attack into the Nile Delta if it was not for a ceasefire. This war would trigger major changes in the geopolitics of the Middle East, led to a period called the Naksa, or setback in Arabic, and yet on the sidelines of the battlefields, another project was occurring, one that would provide Israeli scientists and researchers the chance to better study the Lessepian migration of species of fish, plankton, mollusks, crabs, crustaceans, marine life from the Red Sea and through the canal and into the Mediterranean. For American and Israeli scientists, the 1967 Egyptian-Israeli War would give them an opportunity to enter spaces in which Israeli researchers had never been. Benefiting from the archival material at the Smithsonian Institution in D.C., published research articles, and information available from a number of Israeli academic institutions online, this section interrogates the joint expedition to collect specimens for study from the Red Sea and on the other end of the canal, the Mediterranean. Yet as Israel expanded its gains into the Sinai and the canal it occupied, there was a flurry of activity related to new avenues of research. I'm going to switch my slide. I apologize. This would mark a turning point in the co-run project that had been receiving funding off and on since the 1950s for both the Americans and the Israelis to study the Eastern Mediterranean littoral and the Red Sea area south of Port Iliad. As such, the historical research done by American and Israeli zoobiologists on Lessepian migration and the movement of fauna and the sea life into and through the canal connected scientific research to war, geopolitics, and the colonial enterprise in the Sinai, demonstrating political linkages between war and research. Of course, we know that. For America, it provided research observations and data towards understanding the ways in which marine fauna travel through their own colonial endeavors at the Panama Canal. While researching another topic, I began to read an article from the Israeli Journal of Zoology published by F.D. Poor and Dr. Ilana Ferber, and it is here where something from the first paragraph caught my attention. They say, a complete oceanographic and biological survey of the Suez Canal is still an unattainable goal. The muses of science have to be silent when guns are roaring. But in the brief respites, the Hebrew University Smithsonian Institution Joint Program team managed to get a relatively good collection from the canal. The muses of science have to be silent when guns are roaring was quite real for a number of members of the Israeli members of the Joint Research Team. With universal mandatory service for both male and female citizens of Israel, war meant that service to the nation would preclude any intellectual service. Yet the war provided an opportunity for members of the Israeli team who were already at the canal as part of the Israeli armed forces. They could start when the hostilities ceased to begin to collect specimens. As we will see, the project slated only for the Mediterranean and Red Sea would, prior to 1967, would grow to include the Suez Canal, highlighting once again the confluence between war and science. It was originally planned with a proposal for cooperative, what they called Mambo research on the biological interchanges between the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, and Red Seas through the Suez Canal. But they were only able prior to 67 to study these two seas apart. During meetings in 1965 between scientists from around the Mediterranean Sea, the project would develop to include new spaces as war changed the sovereignty of landscapes in the region. This current iteration of study on the Eastern Mediterranean littoral began with a letter from a department of the Israel Ports Authority, the the Coast Study Division, requesting funding for a project that would look at the Mediterranean Sea and the waterscape around Israeli ports. They say the Eastern Mediterranean sector is especially a little investigated area. The sand movement in its southeastern part, in accordance to meteorological conditions, they say waves, winds, tides, etc. The coastal region, breakers, sandbars, coastal currents, etc., and their interrelation were investigated by the Coast Study Department in the past from 1958. But the project would expand into the ports, lakes, and the Suez Canal waterway as Israel occupied the land after the Egyptian defeat of 67. Under the guise of scientific research and collection of marine biota, the Smithsonian Institute would work hand in hand to support through grants, material, and personnel the collection of marine zoological material from the occupied lands along the canal in Egypt. Its support of the Israel Ports Authority, essentially the Israel Coast Guards, is another example of the ways in which the Israeli and military apparatus funds and supports its work to secure the lands controlled and even occupied by Israel. In essence, the Smithsonian Institution supported was an illegal project to collect specimens on a landscape which was occupied only recently. With Egyptian territorial losses, the lands that were once off limits were now accessible. Discussions expanded the plan for collection of marine biota to happen simultaneously in both seas by collecting specimens as close to Egyptian territorial waters as possible and along the coastal regions of Israel. Approached by F.D. Poor and Heinz Steinitz, the assistant director for oceanography at the Museum of Natural History, I.E. Wallen led the proposal through the Smithsonian's funding system and was an enthusiastic supporter of the project from its inception. As such, the project's goals prior to the outbreak of war and Israeli control of the canal were to study the movement of Lessepian marine biota from the Red Sea to Mediterranean while avoiding the canal. Even though it was a transitional zone of movement, they believed they could get around this by studying the two zones separately. As such, the initial proposal accepted that the two seas should be studied by examining the Red Sea biota and then by seeing which marine life made it to the Mediterranean, all this without touching the canal. Yet the 1967 war, as you can see here, war changed the trajectory of research collection goals and the spending of grant money for a brief moment for a brief moment. In the internal discussions between Smithsonian professionals and Israeli scientists prior to the start of the project in 1965 and 66, questions arose to why not just include Egypt in the scientific endeavor, but Israelis were opposed to working with the Egyptian government or even scientific community due to the increased hostilities between the two nations. Working together might have solved this problem studying canal zone jointly, but ongoing talk of war squashed any hopes of scientific collaboration. The War of 1967, while it was a major turning point for Israeli political and military detente, it also became a principal moment of collection for Israeli and American zoologists as new landscapes came under military control during the cessation of fighting. Following the way of organic material collected by the Israeli American scientists would in the near future end up in Israel proper, forming the first series of collections that would become a massive archive of biota material from the Mediterranean and Red Sea regions and alongside the canal. With a significant number of zoologists in the study participating as part from Hebrew University and who are already reservist members of the Israeli military, they stood ready in between shelling to collect material from their counterparts outside of the canal area. It further helped the scientists to conclude in a grant follow up that the material from the canal was already providing important and proving important, and demonstrating that the migration process from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea was step by step. This important finding demonstrated what scientists had always hypothesized that the movement of Lessepian biota through the canal was a gradual process over time. This due to proximity and with access through the Israeli army, Israeli scientists pushed for the samplings to be sorted and cataloged in Israel instead of following what had been agreed upon initially to send it to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. We recognize the difficulty and hardship associated with making the collections at the Suez Canal I think it is proper that these remain in Israel and intact as a single collection, is what the Smithsonian director agreed to eventually. Thus, the confluence of war, fear of the materials loss, and the proximity of the occupying power to the landscape being studied proved to be in the larger interest of the Israeli scientists, and in the future, the Suez Canal specimens would be thoroughly sorted at a later date. That project continued to 1998 without completing a final sorting of all biota collected from the expedition, a telling detail about the dearth of material available. There remains plankton and other myobasinic or small fresh and saltwater fauna and living organisms that still need taxonomists to delineate where the specimen is to be sorted. In conclusion, these three cases point to ways in which the Mediterranean Sea was remade and exchanges shaped the sea, people, and nations surrounding it. In one part, the canal changed the marine life of the Eastern Mediterranean, with these alien species now becoming part and parcel of the marine biota of the air of the sea. Additionally, the growth of the port and expansion of the canal of the century led to more and more goods and the rise of bigger ports and sites across the globe, and especially in the Mediterranean Sea. Finally, the memories of life along the canal sailed with former residents of the cities, excuse me, of the cities who looked back nostalgically to their time in Ismailia and along the Suez Canal. All of these ways have produced new cities, created cross-Mediterranean ties, and forever affected the marine life of the Mediterranean Sea. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this fascinating talk, and also challenging, as we were discussing at the beginning, because you managed to put in a longue durée history, but it's also an interdisciplinary one. Yeah, so you bring in many threads, and you've tried to connect them in a manner that makes sense. And I'm sure different people will have questions about the overall narrative, but also maybe the different dimensions you've touched upon. So thanks a lot for that. Very interesting and engaging. I have questions of my own, but maybe I'll pass the word on to somebody else first.
And could everyone just introduce themselves maybe so I can know who's there in like maybe a brief bio or where they're
But
at.
maybe the people before asking their questions, right? That would make
Yeah.
more
Yeah, yeah.
sense because there is a bunch of people. So whoever wants to speak, please introduce yourself first.
Also, Mohammed, would you mind, sorry, stop sharing the presentation so we can see
Gotcha.
everything?
Yeah.
I think, vale.
Yeah, Alessandra, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Alessandra, and thank you for the presentation. I'm just in a place where there's a little bit of noise, so please tell me if you cannot hear me. I think I'm very impressed by your presentation and by the way you mix cultural history and socioeconomic history with the science history. And also, I think we are working on a topic which is on two topics which are very close to each other. So what I wanted to ask you concerns the 1970s and the first, what you mentioned as the first or one of the first project on reception migration. I'm asking this since I'm also working on this concerning the Mambo Association, which you mentioned before, and I was wondering whether there would be some room for collaboration on this topic, since it seems to me that you are working on a slightly different periods, but one which is very strongly connected.
Should we take a number of questions or should I answer, Alessandro?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so no, I'm continuing trying to understand the project better. Can you hear me well, Alessandra? Great. So uh, I'm very much interested in. I've always been interested in the Lesseps migration, and there was early work done on it prior to nationalization and Egyptian independence in '52. But the work in the 1970s is really interesting because it's like a culmination of like 40 plus years, 40 years of rule of mandate scientists, beginning the research as they're migrating. They're all coming with their skills and they're starting to study, and it's a culmination of all of that research to try to understand the Mediterranean and the seas that they have access to. And the What's really fascinating is what a lot of what I've seen from the research in the scientific community around Lesseps migration is connected to the work of F.D. Poor, and the work that came out of the collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution and the Coast Study Department and Hebrew University. And that continues to play a part in how scientists or some of the data, some of the ideas of which scientists study the Eastern Mediterranean. And I find that very interesting. And I'm open to more collaboration to understand. I would love to understand Mambo better. I know there are other archives that I need to access, and I find it particularly interesting. I believe Mambo is headquartered in Tunis for a period of time, and that was a political choice, and so I find it very interesting the mix of politics and science with Lesseps migration, which changes the Eastern Mediterranean in a lot of ways. So I'd be open to discuss that more for sure.
Can I add real quick, in case Alessandra forgets to mention it, that her own presentation on Mambo was last month and it has not been yet uploaded to our channel because of some technical difficulties, but it will be in the next maybe week. So you'll be able to see some of that there.
Lovely. I'll keep eye out for that.
Jit, you had a question?
Yeah. Hi, Mohamed. I'm Yip. I'm a historian of science, working on mostly the early modern period, but I'm interested in the 20th century too. I've got a few questions. Let me just go with one first. So I would like to hear a little bit more about something that you mentioned in the beginning of your talk about ships being quarantined in Port Suez before hitting the Mediterranean. You were saying that the major, it seemed from what you said that the major political push from that came from Cairo, but I'm wondering to what extent did, European cities, the European governments try to contain this to Egypt, the quarantining, so that people could be free? Is that a thing that was happening, that free shipping happened as soon as people hit the Mediterranean?
No.
Or is
So,
that
so in terms of like free movement of ships and people, so
well, non-quarantine movements? Let's put it that way.
on quarantine. So no, so the quarantine process happens all along the Ottoman Empire. Happens in the Indian Ocean even prior, depending on where the ship is coming from. But in particular, in the 1890s, there's a lot of discussion around the pilgrimage, the annual Hajj, which just concluded, interestingly enough, and uh, the concern was this fear, this belief that cholera and plague spread globally after the during this period of populations coming together for the pilgrimage and then leaving and dispersing. So there are medical checks by Ottoman officials in Jeddah prior to leaving from the peninsula into the Red Sea. There is they are ship captains are supposed to monitor as agreements have developed between the Ottoman Empire and European capitals in the 19th century. Ship captains are supposed to monitor the passengers. Anyone who's gets sick, they're supposed to then relay that to the next port, and or tell them before they enter the port and stop at El Tur, which is actually before, just a little bit before Suez on the western side of the Sinai Peninsula. So they would quarantine there, or the passengers who were needed to be quarantined would disembark. Now they would quarantine at Suez as well. There's a quarantine station there. There's a quarantine station at Port Said as well. Very rudimentary in the beginning, but becomes more official, and there's hospitals there. So you could quarantine in Port Said as well. Now ships could get past, and they could sometimes end up figuring out later that they have a sick passenger, and they would have to then quarantine again in the Mediterranean, so at Cyprus or Malta. So it was a continual process of trying to make sure that no one with plague or cholera, so if port entered the Mediterranean, or left on a ship going to Europe, which is really hard to contain. So a lot of it was around fears of like, oh, if there was like what they would call an outbreak, sometimes maybe two or three people getting what seemed like cholera in Port Said, the last ships that had left could be quarantined in the Mediterranean at a port. The European capitals were, in particular the British, they wanted to promote free movement of the ships, and so there's researchers have shown, or historians have shown, that the British were really, while they were putting together and working with the Ottoman Empire and other capitals to hold these sanitary conferences, they were really concerned about the free movement of goods. And so they found that quarantines would slow down, the movement of raw material from their colonies to Great Britain in particular, to be highly problematic. And so there was a lot of debate about quarantine practices. So while they wanted to keep plague and cholera and treat it as a oriental disease and keep it in the Ottoman Empire in a way, trying to imprison it as best as they thought they could. They didn't want to hinder global traffic on the other side of it, and those economic reasonings tended to outweigh health concerns at some respect, at least in like the diplomatic correspondence that we see. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you for your question.
Did you have more?
I can have that.
Do you have more?
No.
Hi, Mohamed. Thank you so much for this. I'm Amada. I'm doing a PhD here at Seville, and I'm working on submarine telegraphy between the Ottoman, Italian, and Libya, sort of areas in the Mediterranean.
Very cool.
Although I'm gonna move a bit away from that. I'm gonna go back to the beginning of your presentation as well, and I was gonna ask a bit. I had a bunch of questions, so I'm gonna try to prioritize, but mostly about Timza. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more. Well, first of all, I was wondering, I'm sorry if I missed this, but was this only circulated in France exclusively, or was it specifically just about past experiences of former colonizers, or was there also something about current event in Egypt? Did they have any material relationship with Egypt still, or after 56? Was that impossible?
So for some of them, they did, who were Egyptian French, who ended up becoming part of the association, they would there were a number of Egyptians who had migrated to France, not because of the war, but just they ended up there, who were part of this, who became part of the association. They would have they would have material connections to Egypt. The those the French populations that had lived in Egypt really were disconnected in a way. So the journal served as like a memory project for them, where they could, but they also shared what was happening currently in Egypt. They, you know, were saddened by the war and the effects of the war. They looked upon the time profoundly, that the time that they lived in Egypt. It seemed to be circulated primarily in France. I don't see any details about circulation in Egypt, but it seems to have been an association with an address, if my memory serves me correctly, in Paris. And so the association was headed in France, and they would have their meetings, their dinners, meetups in France, and they would share phone numbers and addresses of those who had lived in Egypt and who were now, you know, in France. It wasn't just French nationals who had repatriated. It was also Egyptian expatriates who were now living in France.
And I was wondering if there's anything from TISMA or even other sources regarding sort of French relations vis-a-vis the other Europeans in Egypt with respect to then the indigenous population there. And I'm talking both about potentially the British, but also then the workers, which were either Italian, Maltese, Greek, and then again vis-a-vis then the indigenous population, because I'm sort of interested in this. I'm wondering if we can talk about a form of hierarchy, imperial hierarchy within the Mediterranean between sort of Northern Europe, Southern Europe, the Ottomans, the Maghreb, and then the indigenous populations of Northern Africa. Yes, sorry, that's.
No, I think that's a great question, and I would turn to my colleague Lucia Carminetti, who has done a lot of work, as you probably know, on Italian, Maltese, and other Southern European migrant labor who ended up in Egypt. From what I see from the journal, there doesn't seem to be much collaboration or discussion of with those populations that ended up back in Malta, for example, post 56, or, you know, who are, or Greek pilots, for example. It seems like if you look at like what happens in Greece, it just seems like the populations go back and create their own memory associations. I don't see collaboration yet. I'm not fully immersed in it because I don't have all the archival material. But even from what I've read on the Greek associations, I don't see much collaboration there with other foreign memorial associations or such. It seems to be very localized, which may speak to ideas of nationalism, definitely hierarchy, right? The French saw themselves as administrators and the experts, and so maybe that, for sure, that played a part in it. But I would turn to Lucia or the Greek scholar that I'm forgetting his name right now, who's worked on Greek migrant or Greek populations in Egypt, for a better answer.
Thank you.
Can I
Please.
follow up on that? I'm super interested in this association and the journal as well, because as you say, they are definitely, some sort of unique archive. And I guess what is very interesting about them is that it's memory making at such a small scale, that it's such a localized thing specifically for that region. What I'm wondering is, how does it relate not only to other countries, but also potentially French people in other regions of Egypt? Is this group, from what you described, seems to be very, very close, this association? Is that something that you see elsewhere as well, or do you have knowledge of how it related to other associations that might exist within France?
It's a good question. I haven't studied all of the associations. I really focused just on the TIMSA because I was able to find almost a complete archive of their journals, digitized by the Center in Alexandria for Francophone newspapers. The I would suspect there is some interconnection between other French associations. I know that they were definitely connecting to and sharing with the Suez Canal Association. That is based in in France, that becomes a memorial kind of association after they lose their power in Egypt. But in terms of it is very interesting that it is such a local, really centered around Ismailia, and this population who once lived in Ismailia, and their life connecting their life in Egypt with their new life in France. I don't I would like to look further at other associations that exist similar to that, but I haven't. None have jumped out to me yet. But I need to do more archival research, or you could take that on if you're interested. It's a good.
Thanks.
I think Ada has more questions, but
No, you go first. I
and
can.
yeah, I'm going to give you a break,
Yeah,
Ada, and
yeah,
then
take
you'll
your
be
time.
back. Yes, I think it's more of clarification than anything else, but it has to do with what you said about US and Israeli biologists studying already in the 50s, and you related that to the Cold War, or did I interpret it incorrectly?
Not really. I don't
All
really
right.
touch on the Cold War, and I don't
All
see it
right, so
necessarily part of that.
all right. So it was biologists trying to study, already interested in Lesbian migration, but without the same direct access that they would have in the 70s. That was your argument?
Correct.
All
And
right.
so there is FD Poor, who begins to work on this in the 30s, in Palestine. He migrates in the late 20s, and he becomes one of the original founders or scientist founders of the department at Hebrew University. So that's where I was trying to make that earlier connection, that this was a long kind of period of research. It doesn't mean that they didn't look at the research that had happened in the early 20th century, in particular a number of papers and research projects studying and collecting marine life in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. But they wanted to, but there had been no real understanding of how the movement of marine life occurred until what scientists say until the 70s. We start to make these connections because of the work of these Israeli and American scientists.
Yeah, wonderful. You mentioned Karen Albert, and I think she's the one who introduced me to you. So We send her
Nice.
hello from here, and she'll be coming here to a conference we are organizing in November of
Nice.
2025. So that will be great. And then going a little back in time, as I understand, the British were not super happy on building the canal at the beginning, basically because it was a French project. But then once it's built, they realize they want to they want to have it basically. Have you looked at different colonial politics as the weight switched from French dominance? It was an international company from the beginning, but French dominance to British dominance. Is there something interesting in that period?
When you say international politics, what do you mean?
International politics. No, I was international dominance. So not
Dominance, sorry.
international. No. Sorry, I said international project. That's what I
Projects,
that,
okay.
I was trying to say. So it was not a French thing. It was
Yeah.
from the beginning. It was international, but the dominance or the initiative was French at the beginning, but then it became British. And I'm wondering about that transition.
So it's a really interesting question because as you all know, Egypt is occupied by the British after 1882. They become the major occupying power in Egypt. They prior to that, they had bought up the shares, the Egyptian shares of the Suez Canal Company, because the one of the largest shareholders was the Egyptian Khedive, the Egyptian ruler who ruled semi-independently from the Ottoman Sultan. He bought up his shares due to the caisse de la dette and the debt situation that led to Egypt, failing to pay its creditors in Europe post 1869. They had spent so much money rebuilding Cairo. Think about what we're doing today in Cairo, but spending so much money rebuilding Cairo to make it a global, what they thought was a global city on par with Paris in that period, and they spent so much money doing that, spent so much money on other infrastructural projects across Egypt, investments, that they entered into debt, and the shares eventually became British, but and they become a major shareholder in the Suez Canal Company. But for the entire period of the Suez Canal Company's rule until the what I would say the Egyptianization period of the 1920s, where after Egypt gains more and more independence and the constitution is established, and Egyptian parliament is gaining strength, the major player in the Suez Canal zone are the French. And so there continues to be this tension between the British colonial authority running like the public works department, running Egyptian ministries, the health department in Cairo, and trying to push their own imperial dominance on the Suez Canal Associate or company. But the Suez Canal Company, because it was seen as it was an international company built by shareholders, with the French as the largest shareholder, and the French as the controller of the company, would continue to appoint heads to the Suez Canal Company into the 20th century. There was this real interesting push and pull between French and the British empires, but they kind of worked together in a lot of ways. You're right to say in the beginning the British didn't want the French involved. One was because they believed an overland route could be the way, and so they were pushing for Stevenson's train across Egypt, and Robert Stevenson. and his train project to build an Egyptian railway system across Egypt that would link Alexandria and Suez. That would, make, a canal in the Sinai unnecessary in their minds. And so there was this imperial kind of like power play between the two because of that. But eventually, once it's dug, the British come around to it, no, understanding the geopolitical consequences of having the French in control. But the French and Lesseps had promised to be an international waterway, and for the most part, it was an international waterway, and so. By the time the British take control of Egypt, they're working hand in hand with, obviously there's tension, there's differences in opinion, but they're working simultaneously with the French-controlled Suez Canal Company, who control the landscape, a lot of the landscape around the three major cities, and alongside the canal, and the in tension with the British colonial authorities in Cairo. I think it's like a fascinating kind of discussion of sovereignty and multiple sovereignties that I try to get at in the paper on Port Fouad that I sent you a little bit. I get on it, I get into it a little bit there, but in the book project that I'm hoping to wrap up, I try and discuss it more, this tension between the various sovereignties at play.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This competition, but also cooperation between empires, and probably what Ada was pointing out, this hierarchy, of course, that these asymmetries also change with time, yeah, so it's not fixed, and the hierarchy changes along the years.
Exactly.
Sorry, this is top of my head and a little banal, but you think it was like an active understanding at the time that control of infrastructure was a means to sovereignty? Or were they very much going on a daily basis, sort of figuring it out as it went along, because it was such a complex situation with that being international?
So partly the fact that the French had control of the infrastructure, and were physically um, um, uh, had physically and daily been taking care of the canal. They and international agreements with Egypt, which the British continued to abide by, those early treaties from the 1850s, giving the Suez Canal Company, which is supposed to be an international company, right? A globally a shareholder owned company that would for the British, allowing that to continue to run as long as they didn't impede British capital running through, and peoples and ships and materials. It kind of made sense for them to continue to allow them to do as they please in the areas in which the Suez Canal Company had treaty obligations. So in a way, you could think of it as like if they disregard the Suez Canal Company's treaties with Egypt, then the British treaties for concessions elsewhere could be disregarded. And so it makes sense for the British to hold up this idea of the concessionary projects, and concessionary agreements, even in landscapes that they now occupy in 1882. So I think there's a lot of like fascinating questions about why they continue to allow the Suez Canal Company to run things. I will say World War One changes the militarization of the canal, and leads to huge British presence along the canal zone. And that's a very interesting story too, I think. Very good question. A lot to think about there.
I have a last one, which is slightly, yeah, it's obviously related, but Because you said, am I right, that Timsa was first published in the 1970s?
I have a date somewhere. I think it's like 75.
Okay, but because this is a century after Suez, so it would be surprising if there was actual like memories of the opening of Suez. But in general, do you have any source regarding the actual inauguration and anything regarding sort of the local perspective about that? In a sense, I'm wondering if there is an understanding at the time of the opening of Suez that that part of Egypt was, or parts of Egypt were becoming integrated in either the global network or the Mediterranean. Was there any resistance from the indigenous population because they perceived it very clearly that the opening of Suez meant getting closer to Europe in a way, or anything about, again, how they felt regarding the Mediterranean?
No, great question. So while they could talk about what memories they have about early 20th century or mid 20th century life in the canal zone, and they could bring postcards and images of things collected or passed down from the 19th century even. They didn't have that firsthand experience. There's a good deal of writing on the local experience of the Suez Canal, both prior to its opening and after its opening, both by people who lived along the canal, those in Cairo, and even work by some scholars who look at the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, who I was looking for their book was right next to me, so I read it a while ago, but I forget the name of the author. Um, uh, the there is concern about Ottoman sovereignty, for example, of the sea. There's concern about Ottoman sovereignty of Egypt and along the canal. There's concern about Egypt becoming more and more independent, and concern that this would lead to separation of Egypt from the Ottoman Empire, an irrevocable kind of separation, not the agreed upon one that they have this semi-independence in this period. But there is this concern from the Ottoman Empire about what the Suez Canal means for the future of the Mediterranean, for the future of Egypt. Because the Ottoman Empire still sees themselves as being a major player, of course, right, in the Eastern Mediterranean in this period, and they're not ready to give up any kind of sovereignty to the sea. And the locally, there is a pride in terms of the people who dug the canal. There is, poetry that is produced. There's writings. There's folklore that surrounds the people who talk about going to Port Said from Upper Egypt or Lower Egypt to work in these labor gangs at very, very, um, um, in some cases, forced corvée slave labor, and later on, paid very low wages to get around this question of corvée or forced labor in Egypt. But there's a pride that goes back to being a part of the digging of this canal project in terms of its interconnectedness with the Mediterranean and the globe. There is writings and there are discussions, and you see it in newspapers and other writings that talk about the future of Egypt uh, being one of uh, um, possible glory because of the Suez Canal. So it's very interesting. have those stories available to us.
Yes, thank you. I might email you afterward for that book.
Yes, yes, please. I'll send you
Thank
what
so
I
much.
have. And Lucia as well has written on some of the work on laborers and early like Southern European laborers as well as Egyptian laborers in the 1860s prior to the inauguration. So there's some really interesting material there for you too.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Wonderful. So we are reaching the time, but there is time for one more question or not. Yeah, I'm sure there is more, but this we would be here for the whole evening. So yeah, it's also, I suppose, early where you are, right?
Yeah, it's 10:30 in the morning.
Okay, not that early.
No, that's very early. Thank you
That's
so
very-
much for making the effort.
No worries. I was worried I was gonna mess up the time, but
You
I'm glad.
did well, your calculations.
Yeah. And I appreciate you all reading the articles, and I know that there was like it could feel like a disconnected histories that I was kind of going through, but I was trying to hopefully I think it's a good way to start thinking about the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal together in these various ways. So I appreciate the chance to do that here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're looking forward to your forthcoming book, and hopefully because of this interaction and others, you will push a little more even the Mediterranean perspective into that book. So yeah, that's wonderful.
Uh,
Yeah, and we'll keep in touch.
yes,
Yep.
please let me know of any upcoming events, and would love to maybe see you in person one day.
Absolutely. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you all.
Stop recording.